Right, I think we're going live. It is yeah, Thursday the 16th of April. And it's my name is James Callender, one of the MDs here at Fresh Minds, and a very warm welcome to what is our third webinar, which we've been running through the slightly crazy C-19 sort of period. We have one next week, which is with Bryce Hoffman, who wrote the book on resilience, which he learned with the US Army, and he'll be speaking to us next Thursday. More details on that at the end. But most immediately and most importantly, today we're very lucky to have Jon Key, who is a great friend of Fresh Minds, and has very kindly come to join us on the webinar this afternoon to talk about global supply chains, and the impact that COVID-19 has had on it, and really what we might expect from the kind of fallout from supply chains. So super interesting topic. Amazing to see how supply chains have adapted, even in the last sort of 3 or 4 weeks, and very interested to hear from Jon as to where they might be going. And for those of you who don't know Jon and why we think he's a well-qualified man to speak about this, Jon was at Bain & Company, he was at Babcock, I think, he was at the Post Office, and most recently was head of strategy at the Associated British Ports. So really good view of both kind of land and sea, and please a warm virtual welcome to Jon Key.
Right, thanks very much, James. I'm going to start with a bit of a quiz just to wake people up, and it'll be something of a virtual quiz. I'm not sure, and a rhetorical one as well. So does anyone know what this is? I'll put you out of your misery. This is the Exide Challenger. It's Tony Bullamore's boat, and some of you may know the story. Bullamore capsized during the 1996-97 Vendée Globe single-handed round the world yacht race. Southern Ocean, near 52 degrees south, 100 degrees east, which is around 2,500 kilometers off the Australian coast. And he capsized in winds of up to 160 kilometers per hour. Bullamore survived, and he managed to find an air pocket in the upside down boat in pitch darkness, having lost his food supplies aside from a bar of chocolate. And the story is one of self-isolation, innovation, and collaboration. In his crisis, Bullamore innovated. He built a hammock to allow himself to keep out of the freezing water. He survived for 3 days. Imagine that, only 3 days of social distancing, and he applied himself. He was creative and he innovated. And then separately, navies, his competitors, other vessels came to his aid, and they all worked together, and he was saved. So there was collaboration between competitors, cooperation between foreign navies in order to rescue Tony. I'm going to come back to Tony later on in the presentation, but there are some themes in there which I'll touch on as we go through. As James says, I'm Jon. I've worked with a whole range of organisations on strategy, transformation, and innovation over the last 20 years. And during that time, I've worked extensively across the global supply chain, which includes the marine industry. So I've worked, as James said, in commercial ports, but also in shipping, and with on land logistics companies as well. I've also been lucky enough to work in a whole range of other industries as well, from industrial sectors to snack food to soft drinks to fashion, and multinationals with large global supply chains have been clients down the years. I also have a connection with the sea. My grandfather was a merchant seaman who was sunk twice in the Battle of the Atlantic and survived. And I'm around the world So today what I was going to do is provide some background on global supply chains pre-COVID-19 and explain some of the things that had been happening before the crisis. Then I'll go on to what's been happening throughout the crisis with global supply chains and shipping. And then I'll pose some questions about what next. I will focus mainly on shipping because this is a very, very broad topic, and shipping is an area that I think many people don't really know too much about. So hopefully you'll find that interesting. And I want to caveat today's presentation. This is a very broad topic. The situation is changing all the time. There's a huge amount of uncertainty. A lot has been written about how the world will emerge from the COVID-19 crisis. But in my view, no one really knows, and there's no such thing as an expert on this one. I do have some thoughts, though, and examples to share on the topic. And it would be good as we go through, if people have questions, then please pose them. I'll probably pause at the end of each section for questions. So around pre-COVID-19, I'll cover the efficiency and resilience, or lack of, the resilience in shipping and global supply chains. When I talk about the crisis, I'll talk about how supply chains are adapting, collaborating and innovating through the crisis. And then post-crisis, I'll talk about how the future might look for shipping and supply chains, and the opportunity to take a leap forward. So first, a little bit of a 101 on shipping. Most people don't know much about the shipping industry. In fact, probably 90% of everything around you in your workspace that you're getting very used to these days comes via ship. And in some cases, it's coming via ship several times over as it passes through the supply chain as components, raw materials and finished goods. The scale of the marine industry is enormous. And in fact, being an industry of stories, the true scale is not widely agreed upon. But depending on the precise definition, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. And it covers all segments, all countries, large and small ships, with over 2 million people employed directly or indirectly, either on or offshore, plus many more in related industries. So we may not have a precise number for the size and scale of the shipping industry, but let's just agree for now that it's big. It's also incredibly fragmented, so there are multiple segments in the value chain with many players in each one. And as a result, it can be very slow to move, it can be extremely reactive, and it can be susceptible to traditional ways of working and thinking. And it's highly cyclical. It's therefore susceptible to being opaque, pretty closed, relatively short term. And there can even be deception in there and some mistrust traditionally. And it often results to stories rather than data. As a result, it's therefore highly inefficient, particularly at the interfaces between the different segments within the industry. This is a scene from Vancouver. The top picture is vessels queuing outside Vancouver port. And watching those vessels, they were there for at least a week, waiting for a berth in Vancouver. They've probably steamed from their origin port and are now just sitting there waiting. They've raced to get there and are now sitting in the queue. The bottom picture is of empty berths within Vancouver port, cranes which are underutilized. In some cases, utilization of these cranes can be less than 5%. And we see this everywhere in marine. There are very high levels of inefficiency. If you ask people working within the marine sector how inefficient is marine, which admittedly is a very unscientific question, they'll give you answers varying from 30%, 50%, 70%. They'll give you examples of container ships spending time waiting at anchor, canal reservations being cancelled or not used, ferries not running or being partially utilised. So there's a very high degree of inefficiency in the marine sector. Again, you could ask how inefficient is marine. If we just agree it's a large number, then you have hundreds of millions of pounds, hundreds of billions of pounds tied up in inefficiency. There are 2 million seafarers in marine. And one question that often comes up is, why is it so inefficient? And the short answer to that, I guess, is around culture. Much of the inefficiency is trapped value and relates to people. If you ask anyone in marine how they're doing, often the first answer that will come back is that they're busy. And it's no wonder. In this world, in marine, we treat people as costs. We focus on margins, we focus on the silos. It tends to be an industry where it's quite insular, inward looking. People tend to strive to protect themselves rather than to take risks. And there's also a lack of information in general terms across the industry. So across marine, there are reasons why collaboration, innovation, working together is often a challenge. It's also an industry that's highly cyclical. Marine has seen many peaks and troughs. This is the Baltic Dry Index, which is the cost of transporting dry goods by ship. And the fluctuations show the cycles in shipping, most notably in 2008. So it's an industry that has huge ups and downs and tends to move as a pack. On the plus side, it has a rich history of innovation. So notable examples include the sea container in the top right, which opened up global trade through standardization. The Panama Canal in the middle, which opened up new trade routes, reducing costs and improving lead times. And the longitudinal clock, which gave sailors important information about their location. What's interesting about all these examples is they all use or draw on collaboration, creativity, experimentation, courage, and attitudes that have driven innovation within this industry down the years. So pre-crisis, pre-COVID-19, marine was actually getting quite interesting in terms of changing some of those traditional attitudes and beginning to see some interesting examples of recent innovation. And global trends at that point were driving some of that. So trade was growing, there was an increasing focus on the environment, regulations were opening up, there was a lot of industry consolidation, new technologies and data was coming on board. There was continued pressure on margins in the industry. New startups were coming along, and so actually, if you looked at 2019, albeit the oil tanker was turning very slowly, there was a rapid or a continuing growth in innovation, new ideas in the industry. And that was important because shipping is highly connected and interlinked with other elements of the supply chain. From the ports or to the ports, there was a very strong linkage between the shipping industry and on-land logistics, rail, road, etc. So what was starting to happen, and I saw this in shipping and ports and rail, in fact, was the industry beginning to share information, beginning to collaborate, and beginning to drive some of those inefficiencies out. And like any industry, there was a combination at that point of people, processes, and technologies working together. So just to summarize, in terms of setting the scene, marine is this enormous industry, $1 to $10 trillion, huge range. It's extremely fragmented and siloed. very inefficient, but this also, by the way, means it has a significant amount of redundancy. It's highly cyclical. It can innovate, and there are many examples in the past. Pre-COVID-19, the conditions for innovation were very good. There were opportunities within marine, but also within ports and land-based logistics. The industry was moving along, but relatively slowly. And it's clear that progress would be about technology, processes, and people. And at the time, back in December, I used the phrase it needed to create its own crisis. Famous last words. So this is COVID. Before I dive in, James, I don't see any questions. I can keep going into the COVID section, or I can stop for breath of.
Yeah, so just feel free to put questions into the question box downstairs, down at the bottom of the screen, the chat box, and we can answer them as we go through.
That was a whistle stop tour, guys, through shipping, but hopefully it gets us onto the same page in terms of what happened next with COVID. So as we know, albeit the disease first started in China and Wuhan, the cruise industry was one of the areas initially where COVID-19 struck. And at points in time, there were cruise ships that had a higher incidence of coronavirus than entire countries. Cruise as an industry has since become pretty much mothballed as a result of the crisis, with ships laid up and orders on hold. And so shipping really did get a crisis, as we all did when COVID-19 came onto the scene. This is a picture of the vessels around the world taken over the course of the last week from logistics data, and it shows clearly that shipping is one of those industries that hasn't stopped. It's continued to run, and in fact, the shipping industry is keeping the world moving, transporting food, supplies, medical equipment, everything. These are seafarers who've suddenly found themselves on the front line. Crews such as these are now going beyond the call of duty. So many of them have had their leaves cancelled. Many of these people will have been due to come off duty in January, February, after 6 months at sea, but they're continuing at sea to keep the world moving and keep trade moving. And of course, everyone at the moment is innovating. So here's Boris talking to the G20 over Zoom, which many people won't have been familiar with a year ago, but obviously now everyone is using Zoom. Innovation is happening everywhere at the moment. This is the ventilator from Ventilator UK, the consortium of Rolls-Royce and others who are innovating in the race to deliver ventilators to the NHS. Here's another picture of Zoom. I'm not sure what this one is. Could be a church service or a society or a business. Again, everyone is innovating at the moment. And unusual events are happening. So these are the goats in Llandudno that some of you may have read about. There are some things happening at the moment that were not predicted, but which are unseen or unexpected consequences of the crisis. And what all of that means is that the conditions for innovation that have existed within the supply chain over the last several years, if anything, as a result of COVID-19, have increased. So when you look into the supply chains, you look at rail, for example, you look at how they're operating at probably half of the capacity that they'd been operating at a year ago. They're having to be incredibly creative about how they live with that, how they take out capacity from the market, how they collaborate with others in the supply chain, and how they use information and data to work through their response to COVID-19. I'll give you an example. This is the supply chain from, at the top left, Louisiana, which obviously this part of the US is one of the hotspots for coronavirus, but it's also the source for wood pellets. Wood pellets are used for biomass fuel generation. The picture on the top right is a wood pellet production facility, which is taking wood from the sustainable forests and turning it into wood pellets. On the bottom left, there's the vessel that's bringing the wood pellets from Louisiana across to Immingham Dock in the northeast of England. And then the bottom right is the vessel being unloaded. One of the things that we're beginning to realize, I think all of us, is how interconnected the world is today, and also how the extent to which it's just in time. The supply chains are so interconnected and interwoven and are operating at such low inventory levels with a focus really on efficiency rather than resilience, that we're beginning to realize that the supply chain, which is continuing here from Immingham by train to Drax, is so important. Top right is Drax Power Station burning that same biomass from Louisiana. Bottom left is then National Grid playing their role in the supply chain and taking the power to all of us, including on the bottom right, someone who is on one of those ventilators that we were just talking about. So one of the things we're all beginning to see and to acknowledge and realize is how these just-in-time supply chains are having to innovate, think the unthinkable, and work in a way during the crisis that enables them to keep goods flowing, but also to use technology and to collaborate in ways that maybe they haven't done in the past. So in summary, we're seeing more collaboration, we're seeing more data sharing, we're actually seeing a lot more innovation at the moment. We're seeing supply chains adapting. We're seeing supply chains working across geographies, to new working practices and regulations. And going back to those seafarers, we're seeing them going the extra mile in order to keep the world moving. And across all of that, what we're seeing are businesses who are learning to operate in that environment and pushing themselves out of their comfort zones to operate in ways that they haven't been able to do in the past. So where do we go from here? And I said earlier on that I wasn't going to try and make predictions. I'll pose a few questions and share some thoughts with the group. It's quite hard to predict. I think the models that are beginning to be put forward by the consultancies, by the banks, by others, by analysts, are beginning to get underneath the type and nature of the recovery. But probably what everyone is missing at the moment is the granularity and the colour around how the world will emerge from COVID-19. In terms of supply chain, a few thoughts. The first is there are going to be some winners coming out of this. So these are some headlines from Amazon pre-crisis, and already at that point, Amazon was beginning to take more control over the supply chain. So increasingly control end to end. It's the consumer facing end of the supply chain, all the way back to manufacturing, and pretty much everything in between, either through ownership or through control and understanding of the supply chain. So top right there, they were acquiring airlines over the last couple of years. Bottom left, they were losing some of their key former suppliers, such as FedEx, and moving to their own in-house supply chains. And then bottom right, increasingly considering moving into shipping and even haulage. So I think prediction one would be businesses like Amazon, if there is anyone like Amazon, will be looking to control, own, and operate increasingly more of their supply chains. And you'll see Amazon continuing to dominate. Jeff Bezos, I was reading the other day, has already profited by $30 billion due to the growth in share price of Amazon over the last few weeks. And obviously a lot of people now are, if anyone wasn't using Amazon before, everybody is using Amazon right now, and that will only increase after the crisis. I think the next point that I'd make is that redundancy is going to be built into supply chains in a way that it hasn't been over the last few years. So I put this example in because it's probably the most interesting example of redundancy in global supply chains. It's the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a Chinese-led venture looking to link the world by railway. There are 74 countries involved, vast levels of investment, and it's potentially hugely disruptive to the shipping industry. And it's been slowly going on under the noses of the marine industry. The objective is to construct and to quote, a unified large market and make full use of both international and domestic markets through cultural exchange and integration to enhance mutual understanding and trust of member nations, ending up in an innovative pattern with capital inflows, talent pool, and technology database. So almost as frightening as Amazon, that one. But what's happening here, it was around efficiency. It was around creating a supply chain that could compete with marine at low cost. I think it will become about redundancy and resilience of supply chains, offering another way of transferring goods around the world. My next prediction would be that shipping crisis, as it has done in previous downturns, and as I said before, it's had many of these, will consolidate further and will continue to tackle the inefficiency. There's to go for in shipping, and I think the shipping industry will take another look at itself and work through where it can take the next layer of cost out and improve efficiency as a result. This cycle will lead to more losation and more winners emerging from the crisis. Next prediction, I think, is there will be more data sharing, more use of technology. Businesses are finding, I think we're all finding that we're accessing and using data and knowledge in a way that we haven't really done in the past. You know, things as simple as the daily briefing by the UK government and the way we're looking at coronavirus information and data, and we're all taking more of a kind of data-driven view on the crisis and how we might emerge, is applying throughout the supply chain. Information is critical when navigating the crisis, and when you're operating and working in ways that you haven't perhaps done in the past. So sharing of information between shipping companies, ports, on-land logistics businesses, etc., I think will become increasingly important. Already before the crisis, blockchain was being talked about a lot in supply chains as a way of safely sharing information through the supply chain. And I think that will only increase after COVID-19. This is one, I guess, for us to reflect on and debate, and I guess we'll find out in the coming weeks where this one is going to go. But personally, I think there will be an increasing amount of collaboration across geographies. I think we'll realise that we can't do this alone. And clearly there is a contrary view there. We may become more inward looking. My own view is that we will become more collaborative because it will ultimately create more value and keep supply chains more resilient and be better for us all. So this is Jack Ma. He's announcing test kits being shipped from China to the US, which is just another example of, on the whole, and Donald Trump's comments of the last 24 hours aside, happening a lot in this crisis in a way that it hasn't done before. We are seeing a greater level of collaboration, sharing of information, cross-border collaboration than we've done pre-crisis. I think it will go hand in hand with also as a form of redundancy and increased resilience, some reshoring and a return of certain supply chains and manufacturing to a point of sale. So I do think the US and the UK and Western economies will build up their own manufacturing. But I also think that the global supply chain, global markets will continue. So I've got 3 or 4 more of these, and then I'll pause for questions. The next one is around planning. So I think we've all had a wake-up call here. This is not something any of us expected, albeit it was something we could probably have seen coming. So this is a survey from 2011 of the top supply chain threats to resilience at that point, and 400 CEOs and other senior executives were interviewed. And you can see, it's quite a scary one actually, because you can see pandemic on there, 11% of respondents. You know, it wasn't up there as a event that anyone was particularly planning for, and we've seen that throughout. You know, the pharmaceutical supply chains, the NHS, the response. You know, this is not something that any of us particularly expected. But there's a lot of other things on that list as well. And my prediction is that the business continuity plans, the resilience plans, scenario planning is going to become much more a part of executives and businesses, business as usual going forward. And they will be looking at these other potential threats and thinking about their supply chains again. I think what will come out of that will be an added layer of resilience in supply chains. So the just-in-time, very thin supply chains will be shored up and made more resilient as a result. Clearly, everything I've just said could come back to haunt me. They're more provocative statements than predictions, and clearly they depend largely on the containment policies and response that's happening now and will happen in the next few months, and the impact that will have, and the interplay between those containment policies and the virus, and the impact that they have on the economics and the economy. So many people have been trying to predict what that will mean. There are a lot of consultants out there with a lot of time on their hands and little else to do, and we've all seen the modelling that's coming out. It's incredibly useful. Typically, there's a y-axis, which is the health response, and there's an x-axis, which is the economic implications or the economic policy. What they're all at the moment ignoring is what I would call the z-axis. So this is, getting beneath the spreadsheets and the numbers. What's going to happen to business models, and what is going to happen to how we work with each other? What will happen to global supply chains at each step, at each stage? And that z-axis is obviously the most difficult one to predict. It comes out of this analysis, but it leads you to questions that are quite difficult to answer. And I think what that means is there will be an increasing use of scenario planning by businesses. And in fact, without calling it that, many businesses are already doing that. So anyone involved in any business at the moment is thinking, even if it's a week, a day ahead, about the scenarios that could impact their business. They're looking again at the levers of their business and how they relate to the external environment, the COVID-19 crisis, the economic, the macroeconomic effects, and how they relate to their business, and using those in order to take decisions as best they can. And I think that scenario planning, that way of thinking about our businesses, will stay with us, and will transition really well, actually, into the planning that we're all going to be doing later on this year for the post-COVID era. So just to summarize, I could have possibly taken a counter view to all of the things I've said. I think they're more questions really than predictions. So I would pose these questions now on that z-axis. Will the growth of vertically integrated players that have well-structured supply chains and the consumer relationship, most notably Amazon, accelerate? I would suggest yes. Will there be a future need to increase the resilience and level of redundancy in supply chains, and therefore invest more, pulling back from the just-in-time model? And I would say almost certainly. Will new levels of efficiency achieved through the crisis be sustained? I think for sure. I think if we take one example, which is home working, I can't imagine that we're all going to be back in the office as we were after the crisis. There will at least be opportunities for taking out some of the bricks and mortar costs from our businesses as a result of the changed behaviour. Is there going to be a step change in sharing information between players throughout the supply chain that will continue beyond the crisis? This is probably the most controversial one. I'm an optimist, and I would say yes. I think there will. Will there be a step change in collaborative behaviour and alliances between suppliers, customers, investors through the supply chain? I'm an optimist. I think these consortia, particularly the manufacturing ones around the ventilator, are fascinating. These are fierce rivals and competitors. My personal belief is after the crisis, the same people will be working together and innovating in peacetime after COVID-19. Will businesses get better now at business continuity planning, including pandemics, but also taking into account other disruptions? I think for sure. This has been a massive wake-up call, and there'll be people thinking about, well, what else could go wrong, or more likely, what if there's another pandemic? And how do we deal with that? What do we need to put in place if this happens again? And then finally, is there going to be more use of scenario planning through the crisis and beyond to inform decisions? Well, yes, I think there will be. So last slide, I'm going to come back to Tony. The combination of innovation, collaboration, and his crisis. So in his case, it led to a successful rescue after 3 days. Tony sailed again. He built in his future voyages all the lessons that he learned, as you can imagine, from the Vendée experience. He built in safety margins. He learned from his mistakes. He actually won races again. He went back to sea and he won races. And he came through stronger. So as an optimist, I personally believe the same will be true of global supply chains, and in fact more broadly after Covid-19. I think we're all learning some very, despite the challenges and the fact, this crisis is an unprecedented and terrible disease, as we all know. But I think it is also teaching us some very positive lessons that will stay with us after the crisis.
Great, thank you very much, Jon. We have a few questions. So can you hear me, Jon?
Yeah.
So could you give us the first one's from an anonymous attendee. Could you give an example of the most glaring inefficiencies you saw pre-corona?
Yes. It's quite hard to pick, actually. I think that the most revealing one was around procurement, and it related to spare parts for ships. And these were parts for deep in the engine room, crankshafts and other engine-related parts for the vessels. And that was a very inefficient process. So none of the part numbers particularly are logged on the vessel. So typically a vessel would order a part, only they would probably have to order 5, so that there was a 1 in 5 chance that they would be able to get the right part that would fit their engine. Often those parts then were not in stock. They would be ordered to the next port of call of the ship. So say the ship was going to Rio, those 5 parts would be ordered to arrive at Rio on a certain date. Typically they would arrive 5 days late, or they would not clear customs. And typically the ship would sail from Rio to its next port of destination. Meanwhile, someone on the ship had the foresight to already acquire 5 parts that were sitting in storage on the vessel, and they'd be able to make do and mend the vessel. While the 5 parts that had been ordered for Rio were FedExed to the next port of call, at which point the vessel would collect the 5 parts, by which time they were not needed. And I'm not making this up.
Yeah.
That's and it doesn't always work that way. I don't want to paint marine as an industry where they're all daft and that's happening the whole time, but it's happening enough in marine and shipping and logistics for it to drive huge inefficiencies and costs.
Great. And then a couple of questions on redundancies. The first one is, do companies not already price redundancies into the supply chain? And if not, why is that?
I think they do, but I think increasingly after round after round of revisiting the supply chain and typically looking at it from a efficiency and cost perspective, over time, you start to take out the second or third plant in another continent. And quite quickly you're left with just 1 or 2 plants or 1 or 2 suppliers that are providing the components for your production. So if you go back to Fukushima and Toyota, and if you remember the challenges that they had getting parts to Sunderland, because there was one particular factory that happened to be based near the Fukushima plant, and the amount of time it took them to rejig and reorganize their supply chains I think the cost of resilience is already built in, but there is insufficient resilience at the moment, and that will need to be increased. Therefore, the cost will increase. So there, Toyota, since they had those issues, have built up alternatives. They've increased the number of suppliers. They will have increased the number of options that they have for those parts and built those into the supply chain. Now that's a special case because they had Fukushima and it hit them specifically very hard. I would suggest that COVID-19 will now have everybody reviewing the resilience of their supply chain.
Yeah, very interesting. In fact, that leads quite nicely to Tom's question, which is, you mentioned redundancy and resilience. Is it the case that highly optimized supply chains by definition are less resilient, having less latency or redundancy in them? How do you balance the need to optimize with the need to build resilience?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think what will need to happen is businesses, supply chains will need to do both. They will need to become more efficient, and many of them are doing through the crisis. But they won't be able to bank all of that value or pass all of that value on to customers, because they will need to invest in their supply chains and make them more resilient. So I think there will need to be investment in supply chains to ensure they are resilient enough to cope with another supply shock like the one we just had.
Great. And yeah, please keep sending in any questions if you have. One for me, which is I sent you the tweet last week actually, John, but it was about, I think it was from Emmanuel Macron, not someone who normally gets featured in a Fresh Minds webinar, but he was just saying that he thinks in the future the supply chains will be both much more localized within France, but then also much more global as well. Could you maybe explore the kind of local supply chain, where you see that kind of going?
Yeah, I saw that, and I think he's I suspect where we will end up will be a balance between heavily localized, introverted, nationalistic manufacturing and supply chains, and globalization. And I think I would agree with what Macron's saying, in that there will be examples of localized French-based manufacturing that will make sense going forward, and there will be other examples of global sourcing that also make sense in the future. And I'd suggest what may happen is this rapid trend towards globalization will slow down after COVID-19, and will be accompanied by an increase in local production, local manufacturing, local supply chains. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, actually. And if people remember Brexit, it seems like a long while ago, and quite trivial these days, doesn't it? But a lot of the discussions that we were having there were around actually the UK not separating off from the world, but almost finding a third way where local manufacturing in parts of the UK would make sense, and I think that still holds, while also balancing that with global supply chains. I think some of the things we're all reading at the moment on a daily basis can make us quite pessimistic, actually, about some kind of retreat into national markets and the borders all coming up, and we're all hearing quotes like that all the time. Personally, I don't think that will work. I think there's too much to be gained by remaining as an open global trading, or keeping global trading open.
Absolutely. But how do you marry that with the kind of, focus more on the local, or be able to, at a national level, produce things and supply things? Or will it be mandated by government that, a certain amount of food production has to be, within the country?
Yeah, I think on the food production, but possibly, and there might be some sectors. Pharmaceuticals is another one where we've got some certain markets have got huge challenges at the moment, um, and the rich countries, the rich markets, the US and others, are almost are using their financial clout to acquire supplies from poorer countries. I think going forward, some of that pharmaceutical, food production, other sectors will be will return to local markets.
Yeah. And next question is from Louisa, which is also probably topical, and again to your point of a sort of a better future, which is, do you see as part of the innovation the need to make the shipping industry more green and more environmentally friendly? Given the changes we're seeing in terms of impact of the lockdown in nature and climate change, what are your thoughts in terms of combining sustainability and innovation in the supply chain in general?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I didn't touch on that actually, but pre-COVID-19, the shipping industry, as every other industry is doing, was very much pushing the green agenda, including more environmentally friendly fuel, including vessel design to incorporate green energy propulsion, including regulations around pollution. The shipping industry was, you could argue, was moving slowly, but it was moving in the right direction. As I say, along with pretty much every other sector and every other industry. This is a concern for me actually, that COVID-19, rightly, we're prioritizing the health and well-being of our populations, prioritizing getting through the crisis, but the environmental pieces have kind of gone by the wayside a little bit. So the number of plastic bags I see people walking down the road with from Sainsbury's, for example, is a very small example of how it feels like we've lost momentum on the green agenda. And my concern post COVID-19 is we will again rightly be focused on the welfare of populations and then economic recovery, and the environmental agenda might take a back seat. So for shipping, I don't know, they have targets for being carbon negative by 2050. Again, I'm an optimist. I would hope that as we get through the crisis and the economy starts to get back together, that those targets will keep those targets, and the green agenda will come back. But it's certainly something we all need to look for. I guess the good thing at the moment is we've got 95% of aircraft are grounded, and no one's driving their cars. So in a funny sort of way, we're all experiencing what that means, and the skies are getting clearer. We're all seeing the canals in Venice getting clearer, the skies of Wuhan, the smog's lifting. So I don't know. It ought, as an optimist, it ought to be a time for all of us to be thinking a bit more about the environment, coming out the other side with with renewed vigor around the issue. Let's hope that's the case.
Yeah, thank you. And then just to build on that, and to probably mix metaphors, turning around a container ship isn't very easy, and there's just a sheer capex involved in taking the sort of global fleet and making it greener. Do you think that's something that could be stomached by the industry, particularly marine?
Yeah, I think so. I think they'll do their bit, and they've shown that already. So 2019, end of 2019, there were some very radical regulations around fuel usage, heavy fuel usage. and the industry struggled actually to be ready for those. But to be fair to it, they've been adopted, and I think if you remember that these are people like you and I, in my case, with young daughters, young children, who won't let it lie. Right, that the CEOs of Maersk and the shipping companies, they're all same way as we are, reflecting on the environment and treating it as a more important issue than we ever did before. And they've made commitments on that front as well. So if you read anything that's written by the CEO of Maersk, the CEO of Wärtsilä, and the other big marine companies, they've all made commitments to improving on emissions and relating to the green agenda. So I guess I've talked myself into optimism there.
Well, good to be optimistic. I think probably the last question now is from Alan, which is yeah. So it's more. I'd love to get involved in innovation opportunities mentioned. Who's recruiting other than Amazon right now? I'm redundant, but a whole load of experience in supply chain and planning. So yeah, in your network, Jon, what are the companies that are hiring? I know e-commerce seems super busy at the moment, but there was obviously been getting jobs right now is probably a lot harder is a lot harder than it clearly was a month ago.
Yeah, I'm seeing, so personally, I'm seeing a lot of activity in private equity on two fronts. One is sorting out their portfolio companies in the hospitality and consumer goods sectors in particular, where there's a lot of COVID-19 urgent cost restructuring and transformation work. But also that the private equity funds are sitting on large amounts of capital, dry powder. So they're beginning to look for the next acquisition targets. So there's some interesting work around commercial due diligence and strategy and market work that I'm seeing. And then there's some industries like water is a good example, where clearly they're impacted by the crisis from an operational perspective, but they're not, they're nowhere near in the realms of a hospitality business or a consumer goods business. And they still have the same challenges and issues around managing their infrastructure assets, using digital technology, data in order to create value. So I think if your guys, the Fresh Minds network, I would argue, ought to be as well placed as any in this environment. It's tough, right? It's tough because people are not hiring in the same way as they were before, but they have as many issues, if not more issues, than they did 3 months ago. You just need to become a COVID-19 crisis management expert, like I am.
Yeah, a few rebranded CVs with a bit of COVID-19 planning on it. That will. I mean, I would just add a little bit on that. Like, I think that clearly there's just a lot of there are obviously some companies hiring a lot right now, but a lot are just probably pausing a bit to see what the upshot is. And I think it's a good time to kind of engage and speak to people and get conversations moving. But probably, in terms of kind of the permanent job market, I probably would be looking to advise about, a bit of caution in terms of timeline. So I'm thinking, we need to wait till we get beyond this peak and then a few more weeks. And then I think you'll start to see a few companies kind of looking around a little bit more and hiring more actively. And that's both on permanent sort of search, but also on the project work. Obviously, you've got the opportunist private equity funds that Jon and I were discussing earlier. But I think, hopefully others will start to hire. And that would be great. Please.
You might also find there's government work and probably work with financial institutions, banks. So I'm working for a bank at the moment. And everyone is stretched in terms of executive bandwidth, and there's just tons to do. And people are wrestling with short-term kind of crisis management issues, but now turning their attention to future strategy and the exit from COVID-19, and what they need are people who can get up to speed really quickly, can jump on a problem like that, and can come in for a short space of time. So I think the interim market ought to, if we're creative enough, I think the interim market ought to be there. I also think the big consulting firms, and you can see this already, are having to reinvent themselves, and in some ways are, they don't have. Imagine, what's the name of the guy that asked the question, James?
Alan.
So Alan, imagine if if you've got an office of 20 people that you're trying to keep employed through this. If you're a Bain or a McKinsey, that's a huge challenge. Whereas, if in a funny sort of way, if you're kind of on your own actually, and you're optimistic and you get out there and have the conversations like James says, then in some ways you're in a better position.
Yeah, definitely. And there's obviously huge opportunities, we hope, ahead on the x-axis of Jon's graphs on that McKinsey report. We've had our full hour. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to everyone kind of signing up and listening in. That's people live now, but also we're sending this out to the network so it can be watched at your leisure later on. And thanks for all your continued support through this torrid time. And a huge thank you to Jon for, as ever, a lucid, fascinating sort of primer on the supply chain and the implications and opportunities that we'll see in the world in the coming months and years. So really interesting. Thank you so much, Jon, and great answering your questions, and stay safe and see you all soon. Thank you.
No problem. See you. Bye.